as a pilgrim, let me say that, coming here, for me, one of the wonderful things going up to the Samadhi is the opportunity to go over and to greet Kitty. Because she's up there. She's up there. And I was remembering years ago, this would have been probably in the early 80s, let's say, in Myrtle Beach, a group of us sitting around with Kitty as people did, because she was a very, very accessible person. She's there with imagine her with 3 or 4 of her friends, and we're having a discussion about reincarnation and karma and so forth. And people are giving forth their ideas, of I expect to reincarnate in, Africa or whatever. Well, this went on for a few minutes, and I can hear this now just as clearly as the moment it happened. Kitty Davy leaned, she's at this point, let's just say, in her early 90s. She leans back in her chair, and she laughs and laughs, and she says, well, I know where I'm ending up. And what she meant was up the hill. And that's where she's ended up. If those women on either side of her are like Baba's fingers, that's Kitty right there. And she was so happy, that she'd be here with Baba forever. So, Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
You start. Hello? Well, when I was thinking of how to start talking about Kitty, what I kept thinking about is the very first time I met Marshall, which I was visiting the center for the first time. I had no idea what the center was, who Kitty was. I knew she was somebody important. And we were sitting at you were sitting at the log cabin. Is that what it's called? And you were sort of giving me the lay of the land, and because there were very few people there, and you said, if you ever see Kitty Davy, look into her eyes. They're pretty good. So that was my introduction to Kitty and to Marshall.
I was right, wasn't I?
Totally. What happened was that afternoon I met Kitty, and I was on her back porch in Dilruba, which was the name of her house, and Kitty had a turtle. What was his name? Jimmy. And there was a visitor from Florida named, who's the one that she wrote the children's book? Ada Schifrin. Ada Schifrin was there, and Kitty asked Ada to take Jimmy for a little walk in the compound while we had lunch. And she didn't want Jimmy to get lost in the woods. And I was sitting there with Kitty, and I didn't know what to say. And I thought, well, Marshall said I should look at her eyes, So I did. And they weren't they were someplace else. And all of a sudden, she just turned around. She said, I think I'll ask you to play a tape tonight because I think you could do that. That was the beginning. Yeah. So.
Jimmy was this old turtle. He was a very old turtle, and he had claws that extended out. They were an inch long. Okay, and Jimmy lived in a box in Kitty's kitchen, and he ate, as far as I could tell, bananas almost exclusively. And there was Beauty, the dog, who was this black dog that was old and sick and not so pretty, sort of like me. And Beauty lived there for several years in the house in those days. This was the home of Elizabeth Patterson that we're talking about there at the center, Dilruba. And Kitty had a room, and there was a woman there named Ruth White who was living there in those days, who had first met Baba in Los Angeles, I believe. And Ruth was in her late 90s at that point. All right. And occasionally Margaret Krask would come to visit from New York. Every year she would come down, which would cause a flutter in that house. And because Kitty would be responsible for entertaining Margaret, okay? And Kitty would make great effort to do this because she was very conscientious and understanding that Margaret and Kitty had stayed each up the hill. They had this tremendous background together and naturally didn't care for each other on a lot of levels. Okay. And what I remember on this one year was Kitty preparing for Margaret's arrival by going out and buying big bottles of bottled beet juice. She ordered this especially from a European company. And she said, looked at me, and she was stacking these in Margaret's bedroom. She said, Margaret likes things like this. So this is 1966 we're talking about. And Margaret Krask came down, and she was a most formidable woman, a wonderful woman. And of course she too is up the hill, as is Elizabeth Patterson. Kitty, when I first met her, was 75 years old. And she had so much energy that it was extraordinary. I mean, she would... Well, the truth of the matter is, in those days, Kitty Davy cleaned the cabins at the center. There was no crew there like you see now. It's 15 people now working at the center. And in those days, there was one man who functioned as the caretaker, and Kitty and Elizabeth greeted the guests at Dilruba. And when it was someone came and left, Kitty would go in and clean that cabin herself. 75. Baba's great disciple. Sweeping out, you know, and changing the linens that you slept in. I had occasion that year, I was given the task of driving Margaret Krask to Florence, South Carolina, from Myrtle Beach, to get on the train to go back to New York City. Because Margaret didn't like to fly, and there was, you know, and our plane service was limited in those days. So she would get on the night train. So here it is, imagine late August, and I'm driving my old Buick. No air conditioning, so the windows are open, which is something that I can recall. It's a wonderful thing. You know, in the South, the air at night in the summertime is very special. So we're zipping through the night, and I'm absolutely intimidated by this woman who's sitting next to me, okay? And I know that in the household, everyone calls her Margaret, okay? And so I would could refer to her as Margaret, but I also had had just enough experience to realize that the people who were far more experienced with her than I was referred to her as Miss Krask. Okay. So we're driving along, and I said to her, Margaret, you knew Kitty before contact with Baba, didn't you? She says, yes. I said, well, you know, Kitty has this terrific energy, this incredible energy. Was it always there, or did Baba give her this energy? And Margaret doesn't say anything for, say, 30 seconds. And then she turns to me and she says, the energy was always there. It just wasn't as well directed. So what we see in the video and the person we met was better directed than, because she had been, of course, even when we met her, with Meher Baba for 35 years. A long time, a long time. What a privilege, what a privilege, what a privilege.
Well, I remember when I first met Kitty, I was so glad to have met her before she died, because she was in her 70s.
Yeah.
You know, knew her 30 more years.
Well, what I would say is, you know, we're introduced this morning as a friend of Kitty, which is a great compliment. But I have to say, without hesitation, that Kitty had a lot of friends. And one of my favorite moments for me is years later, when Kitty was in her last year, in February of 1991. She ultimately died in December, but this is February. And it looked like Kitty was going to die. And this had happened before. I mean, Kitty would periodically get sick, and she'd get terribly ill. And it was, you know, and then pop up again, come back. She had this fabulous quality of coming back. Well, on this particular day in 1991, people were coming to say goodbye to Kitty, as they do. And I had that job for a little while of holding the door, of letting one person in at a time to her hospital room. And out in the hospital, there was a line of people extending down, dozens of people, who had come from all over the United States to say goodbye to Kitty. And this thought passed through me, which I know is absolutely true, that each one of these people, and so many others, were Kitty's close, personal friends. Okay? And then I thought to myself, Kitty Davy has 2,000 close, personal friends. People that she knows who you are, knows your family, and is anxious to see you. That's how expansive this woman was.
Well, do you remember at her funeral, there was it was arranged in one of the black churches in a section of Myrtle Beach, downtown, and people flew in from all over the country, and that place was packed. There were people outside, there were crowds outside. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
You know? And it was true, everybody there lost their closest friend.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But Kitty also told various people that when I die, I want you to play this particular music. You know, I was supposed to play, recording, not play, Mahler's 10th Symphony, and Ambika was supposed to play something, and I mean, I just backed off, but there must have been 15 people who were supposed to be in charge of the music, which was typical.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
She would do things like that.
Well, it was like if you go out to dinner with her. You know, I remember one time we were in this place that she liked to go, and I think it was Ralph Jackson or somebody showed up and said, but I thought we were having dinner together. So she'd made like 10 dinner appointments. And it would always work out.
Well, there was a time that Kitty turned to me and she said, would you like to go to India with me? Would you like to travel to India with me? And I said, of course. And she said, well, we have to keep this very quiet. This has to be our secret now. It's just the two of us are going to go over there. We're just going to do this. Well, in the event, I mean, this is a very privileged thing. Let's be frank here amongst ourselves. I mean, this is very special, right? In the event, there were literally 15 people in this group when we made the trip.
Right.
And my job was to handle the luggage for everybody, you know? So there it is. She could keep a secret. No, she knew everything that went on, and she
shared it with everyone else.
Yeah. One of the, she had this, and she had a book room an office in the book room at the center. Jane Brown sits in that room now if you come to Del Rubo, but in those days it had a little shelf of books because there were very few books about Baba. And people would come over to buy books there and sit with her. I mean, you go buy a book just for the opportunity to go sit with her and spend that hour in there. And of course, one of her great statements to people was,
"Are you a book or a problem?"
Because people would come and share all these different things. One time I called her up on the telephone, and Kitty would pick up the phone and continue to talk, okay? And so this time she did. And she picked up the phone and she's chatting. She was counseling this couple that were having marital problems. Well, I should have hung up the phone, but let's just say I didn't. And the bottom line was, what had happened was that the guy had had an affair, okay? And then the wife had had a lesbian affair. And Kitty was resolving this, okay? And, you know, from listening to the conversation, I realized that I knew these people fairly well. I didn't know about all of this, but now I did. So after several minutes of this, Kitty goes, whoo, which she would do that. You know? And she turns that you could hear her turn to the people, oh, look at this, Marshall's on the telephone. So, and that was a wonderful moment for me and a genuine spiritual experience. And the reason I know that is that I have completely, since that day, forgotten who those people were. I have no idea. So if you're a couple that I knew back then, I assume it's everybody, you know? There it is. It's like, you know. So there it is. What did you tell them? What can you tell somebody like that? You know? They're probably still married. They're probably still here. Who's here? Anyway, and, boy, a book or a problem, So you didn't, what I realized was eventually that I didn't want to be a problem, I mean, I guess that's part of it. People could you could go to her for advice, practical advice and all of that, or she would give it, but, give her a break. What she liked to do was to go out for dinner, socialize, be with her friends, talk about Baba.
You're doing fine.
Okay. Well, just to say that this woman was born in London in 1891, okay? This little girl, Catherine Louise Davy. Her father was a printer, if I'm not published.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we found out at the end of her life.
Yeah.
When these two women showed up who were distant relatives.
Yeah.
And they were researching her family tree, and they discovered her and came to the center.
Yeah.
And they said that the Davies were a printing dynasty.
Yeah.
And when I first met her, she had told me that she used to set type in her father's shop.
She was presented to Queen Victoria. I once heard, and I'm not sure that this is true, that her father had the honorary title of Mayor of London. They lived, she on that house in Russell Road, and they came from this immensely substantial background, English background. She had brothers, she had sisters. Herbert, her brother, whom she loved dearly, was one of the early men with Baba, Herbert Davy. She was 40 years old when she came in contact with Meherabad, 40 years old, and was an unmarried music teacher. All of those, you think of that. I mean, this was a very cloistered life in many ways. Okay. And then one day she met Meherabad. And eventually came to India, came to live here. Her family disinherited her. Okay. I mean, you didn't do that in those days. You certainly didn't. When Baba first went to London, he stayed in her house, but she had to beg her father to let an Indian stay overnight. So she started, as you heard in that video, I think it's safe to say, like many of those other people from those times, Kitty started by giving her life to Baba right away. It was how it was going to be done, what the forms were going to be. I don't think they knew, but she started turning it over immediately, as did Elizabeth, as did Margaret. That style. Not much hesitation there. Because what they were seeing was something that in that world, in England and in the United States, you didn't see. It was like having the sun rise, was the sense that Kitty left when she would talk about that, to see Baba, to meet him.
What was interesting, though, is that Kitty and Elizabeth and Margaret were so different from each other.
Yeah.
And had such different ways of being with Baba, And I know that Margaret, who was very outspoken, she would disapprove of, how much time Kitty spent with people. And she would say, if you can't say it in 10 minutes, it can't be said, And Elizabeth was very much behind the scenes and quiet and had our own style, you know, and they were all so incredibly themselves and different from each other. And each had this long, long history with each other that was so binding, that was filled with both good and bad things, you know.
Kitty ended up in Myrtle Beach in 1952. She was one of the group of women traveling with Baba to the United States in that year, who were residing here in India. She was in the second car at the automobile accident, and was there at Prague, Oklahoma with Baba. The story, of course, is that she was given the duty of sitting with Mera at the hospital. Mera, with those serious head injuries, was sharing a room with Elizabeth Patterson. And Kitty's job, as directed by Baba, was to be there and to make sure that Mera didn't fall out of bed. In the course of a day, Elizabeth asked Kitty if she could call the nurse and ask for a cup of water for Elizabeth, which Kitty did. She stood up and went to the door of the room and tried to flag down a nurse in the hallway, and at that moment, Mera fell out of bed. Unimaginable. And at another time later in the visit, Baba asked Kitty if she would be willing to stay behind and help Elizabeth at the Meher Center, which she agreed to do. And so after all those years here, Kitty now found herself assisting Elizabeth, not really a partner as I think we saw them, but Elizabeth's assistant. In this little town, in those days of a few thousand people, in South Carolina, roughly the American equivalent of Ahmednagar in those days. I mean, just about one of the last places in the world you'd want to be. And yeah, and it was a pretty narrow life for a lot of years. There used to be a Howard Johnson's restaurant in Myrtle Beach, which was a hot dog restaurant. And she and Elizabeth would go there for dinner. And I remember her telling me that they would refer to Meher Baba as by the letter B.
Mr. B.
Mr. B. In case someone overheard them. It was such a small town, you know. So there was a reward.
And they lived in town in Yupon Dunes until the center was open.
Yeah.
I used to work at the newspaper in town in Myrtle Beach, and we'd sit around at lunchtime with some of the people there, and it's a very southern, conservative, unimaginative town, and one of the reporters started talking about reincarnation, and she said the story in town was that Kitty used to be Elizabeth's dog. And that's what they knew about Kitty and Elizabeth, you know?
Yeah. They were so. Elizabeth Patterson was certainly the most esteemed citizen of this community, far and away. She was. I don't even know an analogy. She was like a Queen Victoria. I mean, she was. There was no one in town.
She was like Citizen of the Year many times.
Every year, every year, and maintained this place on the edge of town that people didn't know what went on there. You know, you just didn't know. Didn't know. Kidding.
Well, I remember that when I first moved there, I got a job in the newspaper. Elizabeth told me, "Don't say anything about Baba."
Yeah.
And I moved the end of June, so Silence Day was coming up. And I asked him if I can have the day off because it was a special day in my family. I didn't know what to say. And I said, "No, you can't." And I said, "Well, we just don't talk that day, so I won't be talking." And I remember everybody was very, very nice, and they wrote notes to me even though they could talk, you know. And at the end of the day, they figured it out. It must have been a Jewish holiday because they never met a Jew before.
Silence Day.
And then Elizabeth was very, very clear about keeping Baba very low-key in town. But where I worked was across the street from the bus station, where most of the people who were visiting the center would arrive at. And they knew I was working there, so they'd come in and just say, "Hey, J. Bob."
Yeah.
So despite Elizabeth, the word was out.
That's right. That's right. Kitty had one friend, and I'm drawing a blank on her name. I mean, I'm saying one friend. She had more friends, obviously, than that, those 2,000 friends. But that developed. But she had this one friend locally who was the librarian in Conway, South Carolina, this little town. Epps, yeah, that's it. And, you know, and she would come over. And I remember having tea with, what a stiff tea that would be. You know, these two Kitty would be very proper, and Miss Epps would be very proper, and, you know, but that was then. And then what happened was kids began to come to the Meher Center. And it really started when Baba gave darshan, which he said he did, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And for the center, this dam broke. And in the course of a month, probably 75 people came down to the center to visit. Probably 40 or 50 are still long-term Baba lovers today that you know. The Guns, for instance. Bob Underwood was in that group. This was not a high-class group. but there it is, and everything changed. And what you saw in those days, now we're talking 1967, spring of 1967. And again, Kitty Davy, this woman that you saw on the screen who was, you know, interested in theology and had this background and all, suddenly had the opportunity to deal with some very whacked out individuals. I mean, you know,
all of whom were on the planes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, the first day that I visited the Meher Center in June of 1966, I was assured that I was not on the planes. I mean, they told me I was not on the planes. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, I thought, all that LSD I took and I'm not on even the first plane? That doesn't make any sense. Well, but they knew what they were talking about. So there it was. But there were all these people coming. And the point with regard to Kitty Davy is that this mind and this personality that this woman had was able to sit down across the table from someone who had had a lot of experience in very strange places. And she was able to communicate, to be present, to be right there with on the most real levels. The agility of that mind and that personality. That young girl from London at the age of 76 was so expansive and so agile and so knowledgeable.
And she believed in everybody that came to visit. Anybody, there are people here, I'm sure, that came to visit her during those years. And there wasn't anybody in the world that believed in you more.
Yeah.
And it believed in the Baba in you that you didn't even know, you know. And really, because of that, you got to know him more. You know, it was. I mean, you think back of how any one of us were in our 20s. I mean, you still might be there, I don't know. But we were jerks. But they just thought we were the cat's meow, you know, that we were, Baba was sending these people there, and they wanted to be around us, and they just thought it was great to get together, you know. And if you remember just how silly, uninformed, I mean, it was pretty amazing, their insight into who people really were. And it went on for year in and year out, because way, way later, I remember I was once on the back porch, well, it may have been the late 70s or 80s, and they just knew people right off the bat. And there was a man that was walking down Briarcliff, which is the town adjacent to the center, and he wandered into Delruba. And we were having, I think, lunch on the back porch, and he said, "What is this place?" You know? And Elizabeth got really serious and said, "If you don't want your life to change, don't ask that question." I mean, she was very, often they would say things like, "Oh, you're so lucky you came across this. This is wonderful. I'll tell you all about it." But this was not that way. And the guy insisted, and his life changed. I can't remember his name, but I'm sure you know him. But everything fell apart. But they knew, they just had insights into people. I remember one time I was out there, and a group of people happened to wander in, and Kitty said to somebody, "Take them immediately out to Highway 17 and get them out of here."
Yeah.
You know,
oh, yeah.
They don't belong here, you know. It was stunning, just because, I mean, regularly with them, they were just regular people who allowed you to be friends with them, and that's pretty much the level that I think most people were at with them. But there was something, of course, much more to them. Yeah. And there would be these times, Kitty was notorious for calling people on the phone and having these wild phone escapades, you know. And there's so many, many stories about Kitty and the phone. A silly one is where she was not at all comfortable with technology, but she really wanted to be. And somebody got her a remote phone, you know, one that without the wire. And on it, there was a button that said mute. So she walked across the living room from me, called somebody up, had a conversation, hung up, and said, "Now, you couldn't hear a word I said, could you?" And it was always so funny being with her. It was like, it was great, you know. But there was another time, what was it? Well, there was a time when there was somebody called Ellen Book, who was a nurse, who on Kitty's last year was basically Kitty's nurse. She was a good friend of mine and Marshall's. And Kitty would often call up people and leave messages on their phone or hang up on them and, you know, go on from one thing to another. And she was famous for that, you know. But somehow when she was on Ellen's phone, she always called up Ellen to tell her about a medical situation or something. And she was very, careful in the conversations. And there's this one recording that Ellen had where Kitty was concerned about hanging up abruptly. She didn't want to hurt the phone's feelings. And she kept saying, and she has this recording, now I'm going to hang up now, right? I'm going to hang up right now. Which is completely different than what she was. It was like, you know.
Yeah, because normally she'd just hang up.
That's right. Or there was this one time when a very good friend of mine, Ann Conlon, who many of you know, went out to California with Nisi Jensen, who was also, used to live with in Myrtle Beach. Nisi was going to California, and she was afraid to fly by herself, so Ann went with her. And I brought them to the airport. And after I dropped them off, I felt terrible. It's like my only two friends were gone. They were in California. And I just went down, down, down. And the phone called. The phone rang, and there was Kitty on the other end saying, now Baba wants you in Myrtle Beach, right? Yep, that's what he said, and she hung up. You know, and what it turned out, she was talking to Philip and Susan Lutgendorf. They wanted to move to Myrtle Beach, and Kitty had my story all mixed up, and she thought Baba had told me to move to Myrtle Beach, which he didn't, and she was telling them that, and she was just confirming the story by just calling me up and saying, yes, that's what he said, and hung up. But of course it broke my mood totally, and I was fine, you know. I'm sure you have a million stories like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Kitty just, one thing she did, Kitty loved to go out for dinner. She was very social. And when there would be a new restaurant in town, she would want to try it right away. You know, it didn't matter what it was or how, I mean, there were plenty of places that were 20 and 30 miles away that Kitty would get you in the car and go. You'd go and get a group together and go. And test it out just as seriously as you could. And of course, one of the things is that every once in a while, Kitty would want to have a cigarette after her meal. I don't think she started, well, I don't know her smoking history, but it was about as minimal as you could have, because she did not know how to smoke, really. But she would do it, and it made her so happy to be that wicked.
That's right.
You know, that
right.
wicked.
Let's have a cigarette.
Yeah. She found great pleasure in that, in being bad. Yeah. I was realizing the other day when I was up the hill that, you know, indeed, Kitty was over here on Baba's right hand, and on Baba's left hand was Mansari over here, who was also a bad person, you know, wicked, one, causing a lot of trouble, let's put it that way. And, you know, Kitty, over the years, she didn't try, but she had episodes. She was difficult, apparently.
Well, whenever Elizabeth would go on vacation, she'd go on a trip or something with Jane, and so she'd be gone for a month, and during that month, Kitty entertained everybody in the world. There were people over for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, tea. It was just this wonderful explosion of socializing in Myrtle Beach. And then when Elizabeth would return home, she'd hone everything, bring things back to order, you know.
Elizabeth Patterson used to love to take these vacations and cruises, and she would take Jane Haynes with her dear friend. And Elizabeth would want to be on an ideal for her, I remember her explaining to me one time, was that she wanted to be on a cruise ship that did not have a telephone. Okay, so nobody could call her up. So this is the background. I mean, not only is Elizabeth out of town, but Elizabeth can't even be called. If it gets out of control, the parties at Kitty's house, you know.
Oh, but it was so great. I often had the image of Kitty being kind of like this life force going through the bloodstream of Myrtle Beach, you know, of the Baba community there. Because it was, and when it was like unbridled, it was fabulous. It couldn't go on for too long that way, but it was great. Yeah. Just, this has nothing to do with this, but I remember when Adi, Kairani, and Meherji visited Myrtle Beach in the 70s. I asked Kitty if I could invite them over to my house. I was living with Nisi Jensen in a place called Happy House, which later was moved onto the center. And she said, yes. She said, invite whoever you want, and she would provide the food. She'll bring over snacks or something. So I invited people from the Sun News, you know, who I was with this newspaper. I didn't know who to invite. And Lisa and Eduardo, they were there. I don't know if you remember them. And they came over, and Kitty was late. It was a Friday night. And we were waiting, and we were just talking. But Lisa and Eduardo brought over the food early. And it was this pile of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I was saying, boy, Meherji and Adi had the weirdest taste, you know? And so we served them. And then eventually Kitty came and said, oh, that was the Happy Club food. Happy Club was this group of kids from the poor section of town that would come to the center every Saturday morning and they'd have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah.
I certainly wish that Kitty could be with us today.
Yeah.
Now, that would be a treat for all of us, believe me. That would be a treat.
You know what it reminds me of is that when we would travel with Kitty, Marshall and I were in coach and on one of the trips, and Joy Miller and Kitty were in first class. And Kitty would talk to all of the flight attendants, whatever you call them.
Yeah.
You know, we'd be talking to them and they'd become like her friends, you know. And then she'd send them back to Marshall and me to say there are two other people with Baba back here, you know. And it was quite fantastic. I remember we'd meet her when we get off the planes. We'd get off with Coach, and then we'd see her coming off, and there'd be all these flight attendants around her, and they'd be giving her roses, and they'd be talking to her. And it was just, she was in action.
Yeah.
You know? There's this one story that happened on one of those trips, though, which was that, again, it was that trip. It wasn't the trip when a lot of people, I think it was just the four of us. And I had only one job on that trip, was to take care of Kitty's walker. And it was a very special walker. It had wheels on it, and she had experimented with a lot of walkers, and this was the right walker. And all I had to do was to take care of it. And when we were in Frankfurt, Kitty and Joy Miller were taken by, because they were in first class, you know, ahead of everybody, and they were going down to get on the plane, and Marshall and I had all the hand luggage, and we were trying to keep up with them, and it was very confusing. And finally, we're situated on the plane, and I turned around to Marshall and I said, do you have the walker? And he said, no. And I said, well, I don't either. And that flight was 9 hours, and that whole time I was thinking I had completely messed up Kitty's month-long stay in India because I left the walker someplace. And I asked if they would call back to the Frankfurt airport and search for the walker, and they did, and they said, we can't find any. And it was an awful trip. And I remember I kept thinking, well, I could stay back, and there must be a walker in Bombay. I'll just stay back and find another walker. And then when we get off the plane, there was Joy with the walker. And all the confusion they had taken in.
It was in Frankfurt one time, and it might have just been the two of us with her, that we were wheeling Kitty through the airport, you know, between flights. And lo and behold, one or two men from the German security services stopped us in the middle of this large room. And I remember this fellow, he was in my memory, he was in a leather trench coat.
He was in a leather jacket, and he had a muffler, you know, a scarf, yeah.
And, well, I assumed, I mean, the first assumption that I had was that they were going to question me. I mean, they were looking for terrorists and so forth, but no. Who they questioned was Kitty. They had picked on her. Not me, not her, but Kitty Davy, in the wheelchair, was the one that they checked all the ID on and all of that. Kitty loved it. Oh, she was so...
Do you remember what she said?
What?
She said, they probably thought I was like the gangster mole.
So...
It's a great adventure.
Yeah, it was great fun. And it might have been on that visit or another one that we were driving along. And I think of this whenever I'm traveling from Pune back here. Some village 20, 30 miles down the road in that direction. There came a moment when Kitty said, I need to stop the car. And get out of it. We got out of the car, and it's by the side of the road. This was by the side of the road. And in my memory, we got out, and Kitty remained in the car. Do you remember this? And she sat there, and she just... And I recall she had been not feeling well in the drive.
That's right.
And
That's right.
it looked
That's right.
like she might have just died in the car. 20 miles away from Ahmednagar. And there was this moment or two or three when you're looking at, there she is in the back seat, dead. And then she came back. Not from the dead, but from whatever, she had that incredible ability to pop back that Baba used over all of those years, and she was in fine shape, and was delivered to Meherabad in fine shape.
But I remember, I'm not sure, it was in 1980, I'm not sure if that trip was 1980, when Kitty she stayed at Meherabad, and when she got there, she started feeling not well, and I remember she told you that she wasn't well, and it dawned on you that this is the first time Kitty had ever had jet lag, but during that trip, she wasn't well. And she finally explained to people the reason she wasn't well was because Ronald Reagan was just elected president. It was so funny. Oh, God. And that's when Elizabeth got very, very ill while we were here.
Yes.
And when we got back, she was in the hospital and passed on a few days after Kitty returned and saw her. Wow.
That's right. That's right.
Well, this is a stupid story, but I remember it just made me laugh with that. There was one time I got here, and it was one of the many times I had lost a lot of weight, and was really into clothes, and like at RT, I would figure out outfit I'd wear that day, and things like that. And there was one of the older Baba lovers here who kept saying to me, well, now you can get married. And I kept saying, I don't want to get married. And he said, Baba would want you to get married. And I was appalled. And I remember on a Meherabad day, I went out to visit, and I was visiting with Kitty and Meru. They were in that house across from Meher's porch, and we're sitting outside by the opening there, And I said, this man said I'm supposed to get married, that Baba says I'm supposed to get married. And Kitty turned to Meru and said, Baba never told me to get married. Did he ever tell you to get married? Nah. But it was such a damn relief.
There's that desk where Monty wrote the family letters, that sits there on that porch. And Kitty would stay in one of those bedrooms across from the desk. They would give her, a room out there, clear out some space. Yeah. And it was. Well, of course, one looks back, and as is always the case, you can't appreciate at the moment the depth of that opportunity. Okay.
And what's funny, I'm sure you all know Tex Hightower, and he was devoted to Margaret Krask. And after Margaret died, he said, over the years, I miss her more and more. And I thought that was so unusual. I was surprised. And that's exactly what happens with Kitty, is that she becomes, that's my experience anyway, she just becomes more and more, like you remember more things, and things she said guide you, and jokes that happen make you laugh, It increases the connection. And so many of you so many people have had that relationship with her. It's different to me. I mean, a lot of people who live here, have that relationship with the Mandali that live here, but I've never had a relationship with anybody that I felt liked me that much, and that enjoyed being with me and shared what was most important in me, that was what was most important in them. And that's not like anybody else. I mean, Susan, you were the same. Whoever knew her, it was in their own ways. I used to have, this has nothing to do with what I was saying, but I used to have this, an answering machine it would record on cassettes, And the best time was to get home from work and there'd be a message from Kitty. It's like, oh, I ran out of some milk. Do you think you can come over, And it was like the best thing in the world. I have all of them collected, all those little answering machine things. But it's not nostalgia to remember her. It's enriching,
After Elizabeth passed on, Kitty lived, another 11 years, and was even more the focal point of that Del Ruba life at the center. And Kitty had been sent there, you remember, to help Elizabeth. Okay? And so the standard for so much of what she would do during those years was what would please Elizabeth, because that's what Baba had told Kitty to do. Okay? So now Elizabeth has passed on, but Kitty, just as any of us might remember the Mandali who've gone before as a standard, would remember and consider, what would Elizabeth have wanted me to do in this situation? What would have made her happy to do? And it was sometimes very awkward. I mean, just to be blunt. I mean, and she could have done anything. The love and esteem that she was held in within the Baba community there would have, there's so many people that would have done anything to assist Kitty in any way possible. But her focus was on continuing to work with Elizabeth and to please Baba. That's what that was her criteria.
And to, in a way, be a go-between somehow.
Yeah.
Between the community and Elizabeth. You know, like she was so plugged into the community, and Elizabeth was so private and making everything work, you know. I got to tell you this one story that happened, which I know I've told others, but I had this little press in the garage of Happy House and called it the Baba Press. And one day, and I was working at the Sun News, and in evenings I would run off Baba stuff. And I got this call from Elizabeth to come over, and Elizabeth was very daunting. You had a lot more to do with her than I did. I was just scared to death of her. I never did the right thing around her. And she used to work out of her bedroom. Her bed was like her a desk, you know, and there was like all these papers all around. And she said, you know, she was thinking about that I was calling this little press, you know, the Baba Press, and you can't have in one small town a Baba Press and a Baba Center, because I'd start getting requests for reservations, and she'd start getting requests for books, because people would mix them up. And she said, and I had this dream last night, what about Sheriar Press? And I hated it. And she said, what do you think? And I said, well, I'll think about it. And I left, I opened the door, and there's Kitty right on the other side of the store. And she said, what do you think? And I said, I hate it. And she said, you know, there's Meherabad this and there's Meherabad that, but Sheriar, it's so artistic. And I said, I love it. And of course, we could never have been a commercial press with the name Meherabad Press, you know, which we had to be, you know. Yeah.
Elizabeth worked out of her bedroom. And this morning at breakfast, someone was sharing with me about a mutual friend who's living in limited circumstances physically. And it comes to mind one morning when I went to Del Ruba and Elizabeth and knocked on the door. And Elizabeth says, come in, come in. And I stepped into the hallway, and her bedroom is up in front of me. And she says, come in. Well, one would hesitate to do that, to walk into Elizabeth's room. But she said, come in. And she was sitting on the bed in this little room. And I mean, it's the smallest room in Del Ruba, on this single bed, and she's got these papers in front of her. And she looks up at me and she says, this is the only place in the world that I can call mine, this little bed. This most formidable of women. And Kitty had her bedroom around the corner with her dresser and her bed.
And her record player.
Yeah. And I'm just sitting here, this memory comes back to me one time of how one time, and I think just this one time, I got to brush her hair.
Oh, God.
And
Kitty's.
yeah,
God.
Kitty's hair. And it was long. I mean, it came down, and it was this long hair, this long white hair. And I remember, you know, brushing that and probably realizing at that moment that this was a most unique thing. Most unique.
Well, I remember I'd stay over there at night, and before Kitty would go to bed, she had a vanity, you know, which, you know, with drawers, and a mirror, and she'd sit on the little bench, and I'd be behind her brushing her hair, my absolute favorite thing to do, and she'd be talking to me through the mirror.
Yeah.
And I remember one time, my business partner is named Andy Lesnick, and he too is a formidable guy, you know. And actually Kitty was a little bit daunted by him, because he was very well read, he was very educated, he was at ease in the world, you know, and he was like that. So she had a lot of respect for him, but she was in awe a little. And that morning, I was on the front porch with Kitty, and Andy walked by, and they started joking about Winston Churchill, who Kitty adored and knew a lot about. And they were having this like one-upsmanship, you know, about Winston Churchill. Well, that night, I was combing her hair, and Kitty's looking at me in the mirror, and she said, "I thought I did very well with Andy today, don't you think?" Oh, God. And you know, we always felt Kitty was real close at the press. I mean, she was part of starting it.
Oh, yeah.
When I very, very first time met her, how did that work out? Maybe it was the second time I met her. Oh no, it was the first time I met her, and I had stopped teaching. I was teaching school, and it was in the summertime, so I was on my summer break. But while I was teaching school, I got interested in printing, and I had a little ditto machine that did the purple print and stuff. And I told her that I could either go back to teach in school, or I could learn to be a printer, and I was really interested in that. And she got so excited. She said, "Oh, my father was a printer. I used to set type. There'll be use for a Baba printer in the future." And she was so excited that I decided to become one, you know. And I remember when I came back after I had learned about printing and I moved to Myrtle Beach, she had me write Warren Healy a letter. Warren Healy was a Baba printer who lived out, I think in Seattle, but anyway, on the West Coast. And he had an old letterpress in his basement. And he used to print the most beautiful, I know you've all seen them and may not have realized he did it, but he used to print these wonderful pamphlets. I remember there was the New Humanity, and it had a glossy cover, and it had little gold specks on it. It was like totally his own productions, gorgeous stuff. And she had me write him and say, it was basically, "I hope you won't mind if there's another printer around," or something like that. And he wrote back a wonderful letter saying, "It's been this wonderful meditation on Baba to print," and all this stuff. But she made those connections with everybody, like stuff you'd never think of. You know, she would connect like that, you know. But at any rate, I was saying that after we were in business, I think it was our 25th anniversary, we had a little get-together, you know, during lunch at the press. We're now, the building that we're in now, we had gone through 3 different buildings, and it was a pretty big building, and we all, at lunchtime, got together, and people at the press knew that Andy and I adored Kitty, so they secretly brought her into the celebration. It was in the conference room. And she had written a poem that night, which I really wish I could find, about life at the press and meeting deadlines and all of this stuff, and just completely endeared. I mean, none of the people at the press, everybody knew about Baba, but they were not Baba lovers. But they just fell in love with this person, you know. Oy.
You know, it's such a treat to have had this opportunity to reminisce about Kitty. Today, at the center, when we show a film on, say, a Saturday night, Friday night, film taken at the center, I realized that half of the people in the audience have no idea who Kitty Davy is or Elizabeth Patterson when they appear briefly on the screen. And now, in narrating a film like that, it's come to a place where, you know, this is Kitty Davy, and she came here in 1952 about, you know, just a few words to try to set that place, okay? And at the same time, I can look and see in the front row the seats that they used to be in every time there was a program. Every time. That contrast.
And on those Friday and Saturday night meetings, I know that you observe this, before the program, there'd be a stream of people coming to Kitty saying, you know, oh, I got the job, or I was just accepted into school, or something, you know, and it was really something. Yeah.
Such humanity it's such a wonderful thing, such a great privilege, such a great opportunity to, as all of us in this room know, because here we are in Baba's presence and in the legacy of all of these people that have gone before, and the standard, because you know, each one of you know the quality that we're talking about here. That's such a great thing.
What it reminds me of is that there was once it had to be before 1980, there was a talk in the library on the center. It may have been when Adi or Margie was there, I don't remember, but somebody, an older Baba lover in the audience, got up and started glorifying Elizabeth and saying, none of us would be here if it wasn't for dear Elizabeth. And she shut him up, like, this is not about me. Don't ever say that. Don't go there. And none of it, I mean, we could talk about Kitty all day, but it was only about Baba with her. It was only about her. And she'd never dream of it being any other way. As everybody who knew that,
yeah.
You know?
No, it was all about keeping the focus on Baba. And you could go out for dinner with her and smoke that cigarette or whatever was going to happen and talk about this or that. And somehow, at the end of the evening, you had this Baba-filled experience of that. And it's because there was nothing, in spite of all of this personality and charm that we're talking about.
But she was unaware that she had it.
Yeah, but she was only Baba's instrument.
She used to talk about in 31, when Baba came to England, she couldn't understand why he gathered people around him that he did, because she said there were such good people in the world. And she said, we were all, and that's always how she felt about herself. You know, it's like, in fact, I think she once told Baba, because she loved music so much, that she wished either that she wanted to play the piano again, or maybe in her next lifetime she would. And Baba said, many people can play the piano and many people can do beautiful music, but only you can do what you do for me, you know. But she never felt that way, which just reminds me, this is just a silliness, but it's a Kathy Riley story where Kathy worked at Daruba a lot, and there was this one day, the it's not a postman, a postwoman came to deliver letters, and Kitty went out in the compound to meet her, and she was talking with her, and when she came back, she was all excited, and she said to Kathy, you know, I always thought next lifetime I'd like to be a musician, but I don't think so. I think I'd like to be a postman. And it's like, I get to see everybody, I talk to them, I deliver their letters.
Out moving around.
And she was so 100% unassuming, you know.
So thank you guys for
Yeah.
giving us this opportunity today to remember our friend.
Yeah.